Before soldering the flight stack, I suggest setting aside the frame and preparing the speed controllers for soldering on a mat. In other words, properly pre-tinning them so that when you solder, you can do it quickly without overheating anything. We will be using a T12 soldering iron with a wide tip. The soldering iron has a knife-like tip, type K. Turn it on and start working. First, we need to tin the soldering iron. Clean the tip with a damp sponge to remove oxides and apply solder with flux to tin it. In this case, I'm using so-called rosin core solder, which contains flux. This significantly speeds up the work and allows for fast soldering without using additional flux. Before starting the tinning process, I apply a no-clean flux to the contact pads. Why do we apply it? It increases the surface area of the temperature contact and allows for quick tinning of the necessary surfaces. As a result, you don't overheat the board or the pads. If you are doing it the first time, I recommend purchasing a practice board or something similar from any radio store to practice.
Ви в будь-якому радіомагазині придбайте монтажну плату чи щось інше для того, щоб потренуватися.
Touch with soldering iron and apply solder. The solder melts and forms a droplet. And we spread this droplet across the entire contact area to fully cover the copper alloy pad. We inspect the results and move to the other side. We bring the iron to the pad, we apply the solder to the pad, bring the iron, apply solder, bring the iron, apply solder. Where needed, we spread a bit and solder. Nice soldering iron. This is the first time I'm using this one.
Коли ви переходите до паяння силової частини, зверніть увагу, що у вас є мідь з зворотньої сторони і тут. Вам необхідно залудити з обох сторін.
When you move on to soldering the power section, pay attention that you have copper pads on the reverse side. You need to tin from both sides and in between. This way you increase the contact area and prevent the likelihood of the plate burning out during high loads when you are flying on lithium polymer batteries. Applying flux, cleaning the soldering iron tip, tinning the soldering iron tip, heating up, applying, spreading it,
Все. Регулятори ми залудили. Так, для того, щоб
That's
припаяти...
it. Speed controllers are tinned. For soldering the power cables at an angle, we clean the iron tip.
Наносимо плюс.
Apply flux.
Коли ви запаюєте з верхньої частини, і особливо коли додаєте багато припоїв, будьте готові до того, що
When you solder from the upper part, especially when you add
з плюсом він достатньо текучий. І він знизу буде
when
виглядати...
with heated solder and with flux, it gets pretty much very fluid, and it will form a droplet in the bottom of a speed controller. And after soldering, you must definitely flip it over and remove that protruding part.
проводи.
After I secured the two wires, I need to add more solder.
Більше припоїв.
Now
Тепер вони у нас закріплені.
they are
Навіть якщо я
fixed,
зараз почну
and
додавати
even
сюди
if I start adding more solder here, this wire will not
не тече. І ми
escape from
формуємо
us.
міцну тужну краплинку.
And we will form a strong, powerful droplet.
Другу.
Another one.
Після того, як ми запаяли,
After we have soldered, we examine the soldering results. We check if the droplet doesn't go down there,
контактувати з рамою.
and we don't want it to make the contact with the frame.
Ви бачите,
If you need, you can help the solder flow from the back of the wire a little.
припой перетекти на задню частину провода. Тепер я прикладу це все діло на раму і подивився, як воно у нас подружиться.
Now I would attach the VTX to the frame and see
Як ми далі будемо паяти конденсатор.
how it will connect with the video transmitter, and let's see how we will continue soldering the capacitor.
Все чудово все є. У нас
Place the video transmitter, everything fits nicely. We have enough space and we can place the capacitor here between the wires.
що на конденсаторі маркування мінус.
Note that the capacitor has minus on marking.
Ми обігаємо. Чорний
When we have minus, we put a black heat shrink, and when we have plus, we put a red.
а там, де у нас плюс,
We put a red heat shrink.
обігаємо.
Let's see if we need to cut off any excess heat shrink or if the length suits us. Now I'm trying to see how I like the layout of the capacitor. Let's see if I can reduce the excess by cutting off some of the heat shrinks.
Дивлюся, що я можу дещо зменшити відстань, тобто відрізавши трішки термоусадки.
Remove some.
І прибираємо.
And perform the same exact procedure on the black one.
Проводимо на чорний. Так, плюс-мінус. Дивимося.
Let's see how much we need to cut off.
Чим коротше ніжки, тим менше навантаження на них.
The shorter the legs, the less stress on them and the better the capacitor works.
Щоб мені було легше запаяти, влю краї ніжок.
To make it easier for me to solder, I like to bend the edges of the leads so that they make better contact with the pads. We place the capacitor, position the leads, check, apply the flux. Clean the soldering iron. Tin it. And quickly, with swift motion, applying solder. Soldering the leads.
Якщо у вас при запайці дещо не вдається рівна капля,
if you're having trouble getting a smooth solder drop, I suggest adding flux to ensure good heat transfer. And heat up this area real well. Check if it works. Don't worry if it doesn't work the first time. And breathe. Soldering power wires and capacitor is one of the most responsible and difficult steps, because the efficiency and performance of your drone depends on this soldering. After soldering the power section, before installing the speed controllers on the drone, we need to clean the bottom part and seal it. For cleaning, we use a PCB cleaner. It is isopropyl alcohol. Although I personally like to use the automotive carburetor cleaner. It flushes out all the flux under pressure and cleans very well. But this needs to be done outside. It smells really bad and it will be very difficult to do it at home. Also, when we clean with a brush, we are not only removing flux, but also possible solder droplets that could have fallen on the board when we were soldering. These solder microparticles can later, if not removed, interfere with our drone flying properly. We will wait a few minutes for the alcohol to dry. And after that we will use lacquer. In this case we will use silicone lacquer. Our alcohol has dried and we apply lacquer to the bottom of the board. We take a brush and start applying lacquer from the power contacts. On the speed controllers, we apply lacquer to all the elements, especially carefully in those places where the MOSFETs are soldered. The speed controllers do not have barometers and other parts that should not be lacquered. The only thing you need to do is not to cover. The only thing you have to remember not to do is not to cover this connector with lacquer, where you will later insert the ribbon cable. We have gone through all the main microchips and the switches. Carefully cover these contacts with lacquer so that the lacquer does not get into the connector. The likelihood of moisture getting in there and causing a short circuit is much lower than on the bottom side, but as they say, it is necessary to protect these pads as well. We applied the lacquer and now we need to let it dry for 10-15 minutes. If you are using liquid lacquer to cover the board, sometimes you need to apply 2-3 layers of lacquer in order to completely seal it and be absolutely sure 100% that no moisture will get in. Now we can install the frame and mount the frame. This regulator installed. After this, we start fitting and looking how we will solder the motors. Many people try to solder wires like drone manufacturers do. I do not recommend doing it this way in the beginning, as there is a high risk of creating stressed loop, and the flight controller, which will be in the contact with these wires, will experience unnecessary vibration, and as a result, the drone will fly worse and require much more precise tuning. Therefore, I recommend soldering from this side, leaving a small loop underneath like this. So we look, measure, cut, strip a bit of wire, tin it, and solder one by one. The cables have the correct access to the pads. The thing is, these are 3-phase motors and their rotation direction depends on how they are soldered. Earlier when we didn't have such smart speed controllers and flight controllers, if you soldered and the motor spun in the wrong direction, you would swap any 2 wires. Now you are soldering as convenient for you, and then you set the motor direction in beta flight or in a speed controller configurator. Solder in a sequential manner so that it is convenient for you and you can solder it properly. When I choose how much to cut the wire, I always press my finger below speed controller to form a loop at the bottom. And the wire is not tight after we solder this way, so that it is not tense and it has room for thermal expansion. If you are not sure if you measured the necessary length, it is better to cut a little more and then adjust it in place. After that, with a careful movement, if you are using an X-Acto knife, you cut the silicone wire in a circle and remove it. Measure again how it fits for you, and you can solder. Don't forget that you have a wet sponge for cleaning. You have flux, which is better to apply to the end of the wire in order to evenly distribute heat and solder. You have a soldering iron that you have cleaned, tinned, and then tin the wire. In order for you to get a nice droplet right away, you need to apply flux. Flux creates excellent heat transfer and creates a surface tension which will form a droplet. Fit the next wire, press with your finger. Cut to length. Remove an average of 1.5 to 2 millimeters of insulation. Tin and continue soldering. Don't forget the flux. Be sure to clean the tip. When working with flux and soldering iron, don't forget that you need to air the room and take care of your health, so you don't cause chemical asthma and other diseases by inhaling flux fumes. After you finish soldering, when the board has cooled, you need to check with your finger that there are no sharp spikes. If you have some wires sticking out of the droplet, you can fix that by applying more flux and heating with the iron. After you finish soldering all contact pads, wash the remains of the soldering so that small pieces of solder that may have fallen on MOSFETs do not screw up the results. In electronic, when people work with very sensitive PCBs, they cover the boards with Kapton tape to protect from overheating and solder particles. On the other hand, we don't have many tracks here where the drops can get stuck. They just fall from above and we simply wash them away. After you have soldered, while it dries, you can check the quality of your work using a smoke stopper. What is this device? A smoke stopper is essentially electronic fuse which allows you to turn on the power, and in case of exceeding a certain current limit, it will turn off, preventing the electronics from burning out.
або 2 ампера навантаження.
The smoke stopper, if you look at this,
Живлення.
at its characteristics,
Бачимо, загорілись лампочки. Натискаємо.
allows you to turn on the power, and in case of exceeding a certain current limit, it will turn off, preventing the electronics from burning out. This smoke stopper, if you look at its characteristics, can operate in two modes, 1 ampere and 2 ampere load. We connect the power, we see the lights turn on, we press, the sound came, the power did not disconnect, meaning the regulators and motors are working and there is no short circuit. While we were checking the board with smoke stopper, the alcohol has dried out and we can lacquer our speed controller on top. When lacquering, focus on the soldering points. This is where the lacquer layer should be the thickest and cover all sides. Also lacquer the soldering points of the power wires. Now let's inspect the flight controller. Before installing it, we need to lacquer the bottom. Pay attention to this microchip with a hole. This is barometer. Under no circumstances should it be covered with lacquer or any other substance, because then the barometer will stop working, and on some firmware such as iNav, Autopilot, certain flight modes will be unavailable. In beta flight, if you lacquer it, you will lose the ability to see altitude based on the barometer. So when we lacquer, we carefully go over everything and avoid this microchip. Careful around the barometer. We applied the lacquer to our flight controller on the bottom. We can install it in the correct orientation and let it dry, preparing for soldering other components.